The intake log for Trauma Room 3 was blinking red, a silent, rhythmic scream on the monitor that no one else seemed to notice. Zola Quintrell tapped the glass of her watch face, the metal cold against the sensitive skin of her inner wrist where she always wore it. The time was 2:14 a.m. The pulse of the emergency department was erratic, a fibrillation of slamming doors, rubber soles squeaking on linoleum, and the low, wet coughs of the waiting wounded. Zola didn't look tired. She never looked tired. She sat behind the triage desk with the posture of a statue carved from something distinct and unyielding, like obsidian. Her silver fountain pen, an antique thing that leaked a persistent smear of indigo ink onto her right thumb, hovered over the chart. "Name," she said. Her voice was low, cutting under the wail of a child in the waiting area. The man in front of her was swaying. Taran Qadir. He was young, perhaps 20, with fingernails painted a flat, chipped gray that looked like slate. He gripped the counter with hands that shook, his breath rattling in his chest like wind moving through a cracked pipe. "Taran," he wheezed. "I can't. The pressure." Zola looked up. Through the thick black frames of her glasses, her eyes were unreadable, though if one looked closely, they might catch the white, vertical scar that split her left eyebrow, a disruption in an otherwise perfect mask of professionalism. She saw the dilation in his left pupil, blowing wide like a dying star while the right remained a pinprick. "Head injury?" she asked, already typing, her fingers moving with a speed that contradicted her calm demeanor. "Fell," Taran gasped. "2 days ago, headache. Worse now." "Sit," Zola ordered, pointing to the wheelchair beside the desk. "Do not close your eyes." She reached for the red tag immediate priority. This was a subdural hematoma waiting to burst. The system was overcrowded, the hallways lined with gurneys like cars in a gridlocked tunnel, but Taran Qadir was a ticking bomb. He needed a scan. He needed a drill. She was standing, the tag in her hand, when the double doors to the ambulance bay swung open. Dr. Balian Cross strode in. He was the attending physician for the night, a man who moved with the frantic, jerky energy of a marionette whose strings were pulled too tight. He was chewing on a plastic coffee stirrer, the end already splintered into white jagged teeth, and his scrubs were cut high, revealing socks that never matched one navy, one black, a detail he claimed kept him sharp, but mostly just made him look careless. "Quintrell," Cross barked, not looking at her. He was looking at the board. "Clear bed 4. Now." Zola paused. "Bed 4 is prepped for the stroke protocol incoming from EMS. 5 minutes out. Cancel it." "Divert the ambulance," Cross said, spitting the plastic stirrer into the trash can without breaking stride. "I have a donor admission coming in private transport. Senator Vane's son. Broken clavicle. Pain management." Zola looked at Taran Qadir. The boy's head was lolling forward. He was sliding out of the wheelchair. "Doctor," Zola said. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. It had a frequency that usually cut through the noise. "I have a patient here with unequal pupils and respiratory distress. Possible intracranial bleed. He needs bed 4 for stabilization before imaging." Cross stopped. He turned slowly, the fluorescent lights reflecting off his forehead. He looked at Taran, then he looked at Zola. He didn't see a medical emergency. He saw a kid in a hoodie with chipped nail polish, and he saw a nurse who was speaking when she should be moving. "Is he coding?" Cross asked. "Not yet," Zola said. "But he will be." "Then he waits," Cross said, turning back to the board. "The senator's son is a priority 1 admission. Board policy. Don't pretend you don't know how the funding works in this building, Zola. The policy applies to non-critical care," Zola corrected him, her thumb brushing the ink stain on her finger. "Triage protocols supersede donor status in life-threatening scenarios. Subsection C. Paragraph 4 of the hospital charter." The emergency department went quiet. It was a local silence, a bubble of stillness expanding outward from the triage desk. Nurses stopped sorting IV bags. The security guard by the door looked down at his boots. Correction was dangerous. Correction from a nurse to a doctor was fatal. Correction from a black woman to a white man in a position of unchecked authority was an act of war. Cross walked back to the desk. He leaned over, invading her space, the smell of stale coffee and antiseptic radiating from him. His left pinky finger was trembling, a tiny, rapid spasm against the countertop. "You know," Cross said, his voice dropping to a whisper that carried further than a shout. "I've always wondered why they hired you. You're efficient, sure, like a machine, but you lack context." Zola didn't blink. "The context is a brain bleed, doctor." "The context," Cross hissed, "is that I run this floor, not you. I don't need a lecture on protocol from someone who was hired to check boxes and empty bedpans. You people always think that just because you memorize the manual, you understand the business. You people," the words hung in the air, distinct and heavy, like smoke in a breathless room. It wasn't a slip of the tongue, it was a weapon drawn and fired. It stripped the medical degree from the wall, stripped the years of service from the record, and reduced the interaction to the oldest, ugliest dynamic in the country. Zola felt the heat rise in the room, felt the eyes of the other nurses on her. They were waiting for the explosion. They were waiting for the angry black woman trope to manifest so they could comfortably categorize her and dismiss her validity. They wanted her to shout. They wanted her to point a finger. Dr. Cross wanted it too. He was smiling, a tight, thin expression that didn't reach his eyes. He was waiting for her to give him a reason to fire her. Zola looked at Taran Kadir. He was drooling slightly, his eyes unfocused. If she fought Cross now, security would be called. She would be removed. Taran would be left in the waiting room, and he would die in a plastic chair within the hour. The system demanded obedience. It demanded she swallow the insult to preserve the hierarchy. Zola Quintrell made a choice. She lowered her head. She picked up her silver pen. "Understood, doctor," she said. Her voice was devoid of tone. It was flat, smooth, and terrified absolutely no one. Cross let out a short, triumphant huff. "Good. Clear the bed. Put him," he gestured vaguely at Taran, in the hallway. "Give him Tylenol." Cross turned and marched away, snapping his fingers at a resident to follow him. Zola stood up. She walked around the desk to Taran. She unlocked the brakes on his wheelchair. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Not to him, but to the air. She wheeled him out of the trauma bay, past the open door of bed 4, which was gleaming and ready. She pushed him into the overflow hallway, a dimly lit purgatory where the air conditioning vented directly onto the patients. She parked him against the wall. "Stay with me, Taran," she said softly, checking his pulse. It was thready. She returned to her desk. The insult was still vibrating in her chest, a physical object with sharp edges. "You people, empty bedpans." She sat down. She opened the intake software. Most nurses would have simply logged the transfer. They would have vented in the break room, cried in the car, and come back the next day, eroded a little more by the grind. Zola did not cry. She accessed the command line of the hospital's logistics framework. It was a clunky, DOS-based backend that most staff didn't even know existed, used for billing codes and compliance logging. Her fingers flew across the mechanical keyboard. She didn't file a complaint. Complaints went to HR, and HR worked for the hospital, and the hospital worked for the donors. Complaints were incinerated. Instead, she opened the patient file for the incoming VIP, the senator's son. And then, she opened Taran Kadir's file. She entered a specific code into Taran's record, code 00 Zulu X. It wasn't a medical code. It wasn't a billing code. It was a tag she hadn't used in 6 years, not since she had walked out of a building in Virginia that didn't officially exist. It was a tracer, a digital flag that marked a file for external audit priority, level 5. She wasn't saving him. She couldn't. She had just surrendered his bed. She had condemned him to the hallway because a racist doctor told her to know her place. But she was marking the crime scene. She capped her pen, the silver cap clicking shut with the sound of a pistol hammer locking into place. The ink on her thumb was dark, like a bruise. "Nurse Quintrell," the radio squawked. "VIP transport arriving at Bay 1. "Copy," Zola said. She stood up to greet the senator's son, leaving Taran Kadir to die in the hallway, just as she was told. The doors to the ambulance bay hissed open, admitting a gust of humid night air and the crisp, expensive scent of private security. The arrival of Chase Vane was not a medical event. It was a logistical conquest. 2 private EMTs, their uniforms tailored and their boots free of scuffs, guided the gurney with a reverence usually reserved for religious artifacts. Lying on the crisp white sheets was the senator's son. He was awake, scrolling through a phone held aloft by his good arm. His right arm was immobilized in a sling. He wore a vintage basketball jersey that cost more than Zola's monthly rent, and around his neck hung a heavy, braided gold chain that clinked softly against the metal rails of the bed, a rhythmic, metallic counterpoint to the chaotic noise of the ER. Dr. Cross met them at the threshold of bed 4, the room that should have belonged to Taryn Kadir. "Right this way," Cross said, his voice unrecognizable. The sharp, barking cadence he used with the staff had dissolved into a sycophantic purr. He gestured with a hand that had stopped trembling. "We have the room prepped. Pain management is standing by." Zola followed them in. It was her job. She was the primary nurse for bed 4. She moved like a phantom, her rubber-soled shoes silent on the floor. She watched Cross help transfer Chase Vane to the hospital bed. The boy winced slightly, a small grimace that vanished as soon as he saw the nurse standing there with the intake tablet. "Hey," Chase said, flashing a bright, practiced smile. "Sorry about the fuss. My dad gets worried." "It's no trouble," Cross interjected quickly, stepping between Zola and the patient, effectively blocking her line of sight. "Standard protocol for high-profile admissions. We want to ensure privacy." Zola stepped around the doctor to attach the pulse oximeter to Chase's finger. Her face was a mask of neutral efficiency. She didn't look at Cross. She looked at the monitor. Oxygen saturation 99%. Heart rate 72. Blood pressure 110/70. He was healthy. He was stable. He was taking up a critical care bed for a clavicle fracture that could have been treated in an urgent care clinic or a living room. "Pain scale?" Zola asked, her pen hovering over the chart. "Like a 6? Chase shrugged, then flinched. "Maybe a 7 when I move. Start 2 milligrams of Dilaudid," Cross ordered immediately, "and get him a heated blanket. The air handling in here is atrocious." Zola paused for a fraction of a second. Dilaudid for a minor fracture was aggressive. It was the kind of luxury medicine that greased the wheels of donor relations. In the hallway, 50 feet away, Taryn Kadir was likely experiencing the blinding, crushing agony of his brain swelling against his skull, and he had been prescribed Tylenol. "Doctor," Zola said, her voice soft, "protocol suggests starting with Toradol for—" "Dilaudid," Cross snapped, his eyes flashing with that same dangerous heat from the triage desk. "Do I need to repeat myself, Nurse Quintrell?" "No, doctor." Zola went to the dispensing cabinet. She withdrew the vial. She drew up the clear liquid. She returned to the bedside and pushed the drug into Chase Vane's IV. The boy sighed, his shoulders relaxing as the opioid hit his system. The gold chain on his chest stopped rattling. "Much better," Chase murmured. "Thanks. You guys are great. We take care of our own," Cross said, patting the boy's uninjured shoulder. Zola walked out of the room. The curtain swished shut behind her, sealing off the golden boy in his private sanctuary. The hallway was a different world. It was a tunnel of fluorescent glare and misery. Stretchers were lined up, nose to tail, along the wall. Zola walked past bed 3, past the linen cart, toward the overflow section where she had left Taryn. He was still there. He had slumped sideways in the wheelchair, his head resting against the cool plaster of the wall. Someone, a tech, perhaps, had draped a thin, yellow isolation gown over his shoulders, a pathetic gesture of comfort. Zola stopped. She pretended to check the chart of the patient next to him, an elderly woman with a UTI, but her eyes were on Taryn. His breathing had changed. It was no longer the wheezing gasp of earlier. Now, it was Shane Stokes' respiration, a terrifying cycle of deep, fast breaths followed by temporary apnea, where the breathing stopped entirely for 10, 15 seconds. It was the sound of the brainstem beginning to fail. She reached out and touched his wrist. His skin was clammy, cold sweat pooling in the crook of his elbow. "Zola," a voice whispered. She pulled her hand back as if burned. Standing near the nurse's station was Alara, a charge nurse, with 20 years of tenure and a penchant for wearing holiday-themed scrubs year-round. Today, her top was covered in cartoon pumpkins. Alara motioned for Zola to come over. Zola walked to the station, her spine stiff. "Don't," Alara murmured, leaning in over a pile of discharge papers. She didn't look at Zola. She kept her eyes on her work, aggressively highlighting a form. "He's decompensating," Zola said. "His breathing pattern is irregular. He needs a scan." "Cross has flagged the chart," Alara said, her voice low. He put a note in. "Drug-seeking behavior. Monitor for withdrawal. If you go over his head again tonight, he'll have you walked out by security before shift change." He's already on the phone with the medical director bragging about the vein admission. "He has a head injury," Zola said. "Look at his nails. That's slate dust. He's a roofer or a mason. He fell at work. He's not withdrawing. He's herniating." Alara finally looked up. Her eyes were tired, rimmed with red. She looked at Zola with a mixture of pity and frustration. "Zola, honey," Alara sighed. "I know. We all know Cross is difficult, especially with—" She gestured vaguely at Zola's face, at the air between them. "But the senator is here. The board is watching the metrics tonight. If you make a scene about a hallway admit while Cross is holding court, you won't help that kid. You'll just lose your license." Difficult. That was the word. That was the normalization. Dr. Cross wasn't a racist who was actively letting a young black man die to prove a point about hierarchy. He was just difficult. He was stressed. It was just politics. The language stripped the violence out of the act. It turned manslaughter into a personality quirk. "So we just watch?" Zola asked. "We monitor," Alara corrected. "We document. We wait for a bed to open up naturally. Bed 7 is discharging in an hour. Just keep your head down until then. Please, for your own sake." Alara went back to highlighting. The conversation was over. The social contract of the nursing station had been enforced. Preserve the peace, protect the doctors, survive the shift. Zola went back to her computer. She sat down. The indigo stain on her thumb seemed to throb in time with her own heartbeat. She brought up the logistics command line again. The cursor blinked, a green rectangular eye waiting for input. She checked the timestamp on her previous entry. Code 00 Zulu X. It was buried deep in the metadata of Taryn's file now, invisible to the standard user interface Cross and Alara used. She typed a new line. She didn't enter medical data. She entered a location marker. Is greater than asset status. Hallway B. Unattended. Duration 45 minutes. Is greater than observer. Quintrell Z. Is greater than action. Denied by attending. She wasn't just charting a patient anymore. She was building a timeline for an indictment. Across the room, the door to bed 4 opened. Cross stepped out, laughing at something Chase Vane had said. He looked relaxed, energized by the proximity to power. He caught Zola's eye across the station. He didn't scowl. He winked. It was a small, conspiratorial wink. It said, "We're all professionals here, right? We all know how the game is played." It was an invitation to be complicit, to accept that Taryn Qadir's life was a fair trade for the hospital's prestige. Zola didn't wink back. She didn't look away. She stared at him through her thick black frames, her face as still as a frozen lake. She watched him walk to the coffee machine. Then, from the hallway, there was a sound, not a scream, a thud, the sound of dead weight hitting linoleum. "Help!" A woman's voice shrieked, the daughter of the UTI patient. "He fell! The boy fell!" Zola was up before the chair stopped spinning. She ran, not walked, ran. Taryn was on the floor. He had seized. His body was rigid, arching in a grotesque bow, his heels drumming a frantic rhythm against the floor. Foam, tinged with pink, bubbled at the corners of his mouth. "Gurney!" Zola shouted. Her voice was no longer low. It was a command that cracked the air like a whip. She dropped to her knees beside him, grabbing his shoulder to keep him from smashing his skull against the wall. Dr. Cross appeared at the edge of the hallway. He was holding a fresh cup of coffee. He looked annoyed. "What is this?" Cross asked, stepping over the legs of the UTI patient's daughter. "I told you to give him Tylenol. Is he having a tantrum?" Zola looked up from the floor. She was holding Taryn's head. She felt the heat radiating off him. She saw the left pupil, now blown so wide the iris was gone. "He's posturing," Zola said, her voice shaking with a rage she could no longer completely swallow. "Desiree posturing. He is dying, doctor. Right now. On your floor." Cross looked at the seizing boy. He looked at the family members staring from the nearby stretchers. He looked at the coffee in his hand. "Get him into trauma 2. Cross sighed, as if agreeing to take a call from a telemarketer. "And someone clean this floor. It looks bad." Zola hauled Tehran onto the stretcher with the help of a tech. As they rushed him past the station, the wheels squeaking violently, the doors to bed 4 remained closed. Inside, Chase Vane was warm, high, and safe. The system had normalized the delay. Now, it would try to normalize the death. The hum of the craniotomy drill was a high-pitched mosquito whine that vibrated in the teeth of everyone in Trauma Room 2. It was a violent sound, mechanical and industrial, serving as a jarring counterpoint to the hush that had fallen over the medical team. Zola stood at the head of the bed, managing the airway. She had Taryn's jaw thrust forward, the laryngoscope blade gleaming under the harsh lights as she guided the endotracheal tube past his vocal cords. She moved with a frightening economy of motion. There was no wasted energy, no tremor in her hands. She was an instrument of pure function. Dr. Cross was working on the skull. He had drilled the burr hole to relieve the pressure, and blood, dark, venous, and under immense pressure had geysered out, soaking the blue surgical drapes. "Look at that," Cross muttered, peering into the opening. Massive midline shift. Brain was crushed against the skull. Probably been bleeding for 48 hours. He said it with the detached curiosity of a mechanic inspecting a blown gasket. There was no admission of guilt. No acknowledgement that 45 minutes earlier he had prescribed Tylenol for this exact pathology. "Suction," Cross ordered. Zola watched the monitor. Taryn's heart rate was stabilizing, but his pupils were still sluggish. The damage from the delay was done. Neurons had died while Chase Vane adjusted his heated blanket. Who Taryn Kadir was, his memories, his personality, his ability to speak or laugh, had been eroded, minute by minute, in the hallway. Toxicology screen came back, a resident announced, holding up a tablet. "Negative for opioids, negative for amphetamines, trace cannabis." Cross didn't pause. "False negative," he said dismissively. "Or a synthetic analog the panel doesn't catch. You don't get a bleed like this from a simple fall unless you're compromised." He was probably high, tripped, and forgot to mention it. Typical. Zola's eyes narrowed behind her glasses. This was the pattern. The rewrite. The reality a hard-working young man fell off a roof didn't fit Cross's narrative of the world. So, the reality was discarded. Taryn became a user. The delay in treatment became the patient's fault for being an unreliable narrator. The medical error became an unavoidable tragedy caused by lifestyle factors. "The history indicated a workplace accident, doctor," Zola said. Her voice was flat, audible only to the team at the bedside. Cross laughed. It was a short, sharp bark. "Zola, please. Everyone who comes in here with chipped polish and a hoodie has a workplace accident. It's called an excuse. If we scanned every headache that walked in with a sob story, we'd bankrupt the hospital in a week." The resident nodded in agreement. The respiratory therapist nodded. They accepted the rewrite. It was easier to believe the doctor than to accept that they were accomplices to negligence. It was cleaner. It allowed them to sleep. They finished the stabilization. Taryn was packaged for transport to the neuro ICU. He was alive, but he was a shell. As they wheeled him out, Cross stripped off his bloody gloves and tossed them into the biohazard bin. He looked energized, the adrenaline of the procedure flushing his cheeks. "Good save, team," Cross said, beaming. "That's how we do it. Fast, efficient, saved his life." He believed it. That was the most terrifying part. He truly believed he was the hero of the scene. Zola didn't answer. She stayed behind to clean the room. She wiped the blood from the floor rails. She restocked the gauze. She reorganized the intubation tray. When the room was sterile again, she walked out to the nurse's station. The ER had returned to its equilibrium. The screaming child was gone. The drunk in bed 6 was singing softly. Chase Vane, the senator's son, was asleep in bed 4, his clavicle safely immobilized, his pain managed by the best narcotics the budget allowed. Zola sat at her computer. It was 3:45 a.m., the graveyard hour where the hospital felt less like a place of healing and more like a holding pen for the city's unwanted. She didn't open Taryn's chart. She had already tagged that. Instead, she opened the hospital's archival database. She had access levels that IT didn't know about legacy permissions from a time when she was consulted on biosecurity protocols for the State Department, a line item on her resume that the hospital administration had glossed over, seeing only nurse practitioner and managerial experience. She initiated a query. Is greater than search parameter. Attending. Cross. B. Is greater than filter. Disposition, expired, or permanent disability is greater than filter. Demographics, African American, Hispanic, is greater than filter. Presenting complaint neuro, cardiac. The screen flickered. The cursor blinked. Then, the list populated. It wasn't a list. It was a cascade. Rows of names scrolled down the screen, glowing in amber text against the black background. Marcus Till, age 24. Chest pain, triage, anxiety, outcome, aortic dissection, died in waiting room. Lucia Moreno, age 32, abdominal pain, triage, gastritis, outcome, ruptured ectopic pregnancy, emergency hysterectomy. David Okafor, age 19, confusion, triage, intoxication, outcome, diabetic ketoacidosis, coma. Pattern. In every case, the initial complaint was minimized. In every case, the patient fit a specific demographic profile. In every case, Cross had been the attending, and in the notes, there was always a justifying phrase. Patient, uncooperative, suspected substance use, history, unreliable. It wasn't incompetence. Incompetence is random. It strikes everywhere, like lightning. This was precision. This was a tactical bias that functioned with the reliability of a sniper scope. Cross was filtering who deserved resources and who deserved to wait, and he was doing it with the full protection of the institution. Zola felt a cold, hard knot tighten in her stomach. It wasn't nausea. It was the feeling of a target lock. She recognized this data. She had seen it before, in different data sets, in different countries. She had tracked cell leaders in conflict zones by analyzing the pattern of supply drops. She had identified moles in intelligence networks by tracking the silence in radio traffic. Dr. Bailey Cross wasn't just a bad doctor. He was a systemic threat. Heavy night? Zola minimized the window instantly. She turned. It was Greg, the night security supervisor. He was a good man, tired, with a retirement date circled on a calendar in his locker. He was leaning against the counter, holding a bag of pretzels. Standard, Zola said. How's the perimeter? Quiet, Greg said. He gestured toward bed 4, where the senator's son lay. Except for the suits. Vane's private security is restless. They don't like the look of the lobby. Too many unpredictables, they said. It's an emergency room, Greg. Everyone is unpredictable. Greg chuckled, crunching a pretzel. Yeah, well. They asked if we could clear the waiting room, just empty it out until the senator arrives in the morning. Cross told them he'd see what he could do. Zola went still. Cross said he would clear the waiting room? Yeah, said he could expedite the non-urgent cases. Kick 'em to the curb, basically. Make it look nice for the cameras. Zola looked at the waiting room monitors. There were 12 people out there, a mother with a feverish baby, an old man holding his chest, a construction worker with a lacerated hand. Cross was going to flush them out to sanitize the visual for a politician. He was going to use his medical authority to declare them stable for discharge so the backdrop would be clean. The pattern was escalating. It wasn't just passive neglect anymore. It was active purging. Zola looked down at her hands. Her fingernails were short, unpolished, kept strictly to regulation length. But the hands themselves were strong. She remembered how to set a bone. She remembered how to stitch a wound. And she remembered how to dismantle a network. Greg, Zola said softly, do the cameras in the hallway overflow record audio? Greg frowned. No, just video. Why? Just checking the blind spots, she said. Greg shrugged and wandered off. Zola opened the command line again. She didn't look at the medical files this time. She looked at the server architecture. If she filed a formal report, Cross would bury it. He would cite his clinical judgment. He would have the backing of the senator, whose son he had treated like a prince. Zola would be painted as the disgruntled employee, the angry woman who couldn't handle the pressure. She would be fired, and Cross would continue to kill people like Taryn Cotter, week after week, year after year. The system was designed to survive her dissent. So she wouldn't dissent, she would attack. She needed something undeniable. She needed the one thing that men like Cross, men who lived on the arrogance of their own infallibility, never thought to protect. She needed his voice. She reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone. It was an older model, thick and rugged. She wasn't supposed to have it on the floor. She navigated to the audio settings. She didn't open the standard voice recorder app. She opened a partition in the phone's OS that required a biometric key. Is greater than listening mode. Active. Is greater than upload stream. Encrypted. She slid the phone back into her pocket, the microphone facing outward through the fabric. She stood up. She smoothed her scrubs. She picked up a stack of patient charts, the non-urgent cases from the waiting room that Cross intended to purge. She walked toward the doctor's lounge. Cross was in there. She could hear him laughing on the phone, likely with the senator or the medical director. She was going to walk into the lion's den. She was going to present the charts. She was going to ask him, point blank, to justify discharging these patients. She was going to make him say it. She was going to make him articulate the pattern out loud. She pushed the door open. Cross spun around in his chair, a phone pressed to his ear. He looked annoyed at the interruption, but then he smiled that oily, confident smile. "Hold on, Senator," Cross said into the phone. "My favorite nurse just walked in. Let me handle this." He lowered the phone. "Yes, Zola? I'm busy saving the hospital's funding." "The waiting room," Zola said. Her voice was the bait. It was low, submissive, uncertain. "Greg said you wanted to. Expedite." "Clear it out," Cross corrected. "We need the floor sterile by 0600. But these patients," Zola held up the files, her hand trembling slightly, a calculated affectation. "The baby with the fever, the chest pain. If they can walk, they can leave," Cross said, waving his hand dismissively. "Give them a script for ibuprofen and tell them to follow up with their primary care. If they don't have primary care, well, that's not our problem, is it?" "Is that a medical order, doctor?" Zola asked. "It's an executive order, Zola. Do it, or I'll find a nurse who understands the big picture." "Understood," Zola said. She turned and walked out. In her pocket, the phone vibrated once. "Is greater than capture complete." She had the order, but it wasn't enough. An order could be debated. A tone could be misinterpreted. She needed the consequences to be visible. She needed the pattern to break the surface. Zola walked back to the desk. She didn't discharge the patients. She didn't clear the room. Instead, she sat down and typed a new command into the hidden logistics terminal. "Is greater than override. Fire alarm system, Zone 4 administration. Is greater than trigger. False positive. Heat sensor. Is greater than delay. 2 hours." She wasn't just gathering evidence. She was preparing the stage. When the sun came up, when the senator arrived, when the cameras were rolling, she was going to ensure that the hospital couldn't hide its sins in the dark. She looked at the empty spot in the hallway where Taryn had lain. "I see you," she whispered, and for the first time that night, the obsidian mask slipped, just for a second, revealing the hunter beneath. The silence of 4 a.m. was deceptive. It wasn't a peace. It was a frequency, a low-level hum of high-voltage lighting and ventilation systems recycling the same sterile air. Zola sat at the central station, her hands folded on the desk, perfectly still. To any observer, she was a night nurse zoning out after a trauma code. Inside the machine of her mind, she was running a diagnostic on the timeline. Something was wrong with the geometry of the night. It wasn't just the racism. Racism was a constant variable, like gravity. You accounted for it, you braced against it, but it didn't typically distort the physics of the entire department. Cross's behavior had been too specific. His dismissal of Taryn Kadir hadn't just been callous, it had been performative. He had been loud about the drug seeking. He had been theatrical about the workplace accident. He had aggressively framed the narrative before the patient had even been fully assessed. Zola looked at the monitors. Bed 4, Chase Vane. The senator's son was sleeping deeply, his vitals tracing a lazy, rhythmic green line across the black screen. She looked at the empty space in the hallway where Taryn had seized. 2 young men, same age, same city, arriving within 20 minutes of each other. One broken by a blunt force trauma to the head, one broken by a seatbelt injury to the clavicle. Zola's fingers drifted to the keyboard. She didn't open the hospital records this time. The hospital records were a closed loop of lies. She needed raw data. She minimized the triage software and opened a terminal window that she had buried inside the hospital's printer spooler service. It was a back door she had installed 3 years ago, a digital periscope left over from a life she had supposedly buried in a sealed file at the Pentagon. Before she was Nurse Quintrell, the quiet woman who picked up extra shifts and never complained, she was Analyst Z4. Her specialty hadn't been medicine, it had been pattern recognition in asymmetric warfare. She tracked how insurgents moved supplies through civilian corridors. She knew that when 2 events happened simultaneously in a controlled zone, they were never coincidental. They were vector points. She typed a query. Is greater than access node. City, traffic, op. Center is greater than target. Cam, grid. 44 downtown, uptown transit is greater than timestamp. 1 to 2. The screen filled with noise, then resolved into a grainy, black and white feed of the city streets. It was unauthorized access, a felony that would put her in federal prison for a decade. She didn't blink. She scrubbed the footage backward. 1:45 a.m. The streets were wet with rain. 1:38 a.m. A black SUV, unmarked, speeding through a red light at 5th and Main. 1:32 a.m. Zola froze the frame. The image was blurry, distorted by motion and low light, but the physics were undeniable. A figure was walking on the shoulder of the road, a young man in a hoodie carrying a backpack. Taron Kadir. He was walking home. He looked tired, his head down. Then, the lights. A silver sports coupe, low to the ground, drifting around the corner. It was moving too fast. The tires lost traction on the wet asphalt. The car fishtailed. The impact was silent on the screen, but Zola felt it in her teeth. The car struck the figure. Taryn didn't just fall, he was launched. He hit the windshield, rolled over the roof, and landed hard against the curb. The car didn't stop. It swerved, corrected, and sped away. But in the fraction of a second before the car vanished, the street lamp caught the license plate. And more importantly, it caught the damage. The windshield was shattered on the passenger side. Zola forwarded the footage 2 minutes. 1:34 a.m. A black SUV, the private security detail, pulled up to the scene. Not to help Taryn. They didn't even look at the body on the curb. They sped past him, chasing the silver coupe. Zola switched feeds. She pulled the GPS data from the ambulance dispatch log. A 911 call came in at 1:40 a.m. A passerby found Taryn. An ambulance was dispatched. But the silver coupe? Where did it go? Zola tracked the vehicle's registration. It wasn't registered to Chase Vane. It was registered to a shell company, Vanguard Holdings, the same holding company that donated $3 million to the hospital's new cardiac wing last year. She looked at the intake time for Chase Vane. 2:10 a.m. Arrived by private transport. She looked at the injury report for Chase Vane. Linear fracture, right clavicle, contusion, right shoulder, abrasions from seatbelt. Zola felt the air leave the room. It wasn't a coincidence. Chase Vane hadn't fallen. He had been driving the car. He had hit Taron Kadir, shattered his own windshield, and broken his collarbone in the impact. His security team hadn't called the police. They had scooped him up, put him in a clean car, and brought him here. They left Taron bleeding in the gutter to be found by strangers. And Dr. Cross? Zola replayed the interaction in the trauma bay. The way Cross had physically blocked her from talking to Chase. The way he had ordered Dilaudid immediately enough to make Chase foggy, compliant, and unable to answer questions if the police showed up. But the most damning realization was the Tylenol. Cross hadn't ignored Taron because he was a racist who didn't care. That would have been simple cruelty. This was strategic. Cross had looked at Taron Kadir and realized exactly who he was. He saw the injuries, the pattern of the bumper strike, the glass shards in the hoodie. He knew Taron was the victim of the senator's son. If Taron survived, If he woke up and talked, the senator's career was over. The funding was over. Cross's proximity to power was over. But if Taryn died of a drug overdose or a delayed seeking of care, the problem vanished. The victim became a statistic. The crime scene became a tragedy. Cross hadn't just been negligent. He had made a clinical decision to let the evidence expire. And Zola? She looked at her hands. The hands that had pushed the Dilaudid into Chase Vane's veins. The hands that had wheeled Taryn into the hallway. She had been the tool. Cross had used her efficiency, her obedience, and the very color of her skin to facilitate a murder. He knew she wouldn't cause a scene. He knew she would follow protocol. He counted on her fear of losing her job to ensure the timeline of Taryn's death. She wasn't just a witness. She was the executioner's assistant. A wave of nausea rolled over her, hot and acidic. She gripped the edge of the desk so hard her knuckles turned the color of old bone. "Nurse Quintrell?" The voice came from behind her. It was sharp, professional. She turned. A woman in a gray suit was standing there. She had an earpiece, a tablet, and eyes that scanned the room like a weapon system. This was the senator's chief of staff. She had arrived early to prep the environment. "Dr. Cross mentioned you were the one managing the floor tonight," the woman said. She didn't offer a name. She didn't need to. "I am," Zola said. Her voice sounded hollow to her own ears, detached, as if coming from a radio in another room. "Good. The senator will be here in 20 minutes. We need a clear path from the entrance to bed 4. No visuals of distress. No crying families. No blood on the floor." The woman gestured toward the waiting room. "Is the purge complete?" Zola looked at the woman. She saw the same calculated indifference she had seen in Cross. This woman knew. They all knew. The entire apparatus was here to scrub the stain off the pavement. "The purge," Zola repeated. The word tasted like ash. "The discharge of non-criticals," the woman corrected, her tone sharpening. "Dr. Cross said you handled it." Zola looked at the stack of charts on her desk. The patients she had been ordered to kick out. The witnesses. "It's in process," Zola lied. "Accelerate it," the woman said. She stepped closer, lowering her voice. "We appreciate discretion, Nurse Quintrell. The senator is very generous to those who help his family navigate difficult times. I believe your contract is up for renewal next month." It was a bribe. A naked, clumsy bribe wrapped in a threat. They thought they were talking to a tired, middle-aged nurse who needed the job. They thought they were talking to someone who would be grateful for the scraps falling from the table. They had no idea they were talking to the woman who had once destabilized a regime in the Balkans by exposing a supply chain of stolen medical aid. Zola looked at the woman's tablet, connected to the hospital Wi-Fi, vulnerable. "I understand," Zola said softly. "I'll make sure everything is transparent." The woman nodded, satisfied, and walked toward bed 4 to check on the prince. Zola turned back to her screen. The revelation settled in her chest, heavy and cold. There was no saving Taryn now. The damage to his brain was catastrophic. Even if he lived, he would never tell his story. He would never identify the car. The system had won that round, but the system had made a fatal error. It had assumed that because Zola was silent, she was empty. It had assumed that because she was a nurse, she was merely a vessel for orders. They had insulted her by thinking she couldn't see the pattern. She opened the file named Code 00 Zulu X. She didn't just have a log of the neglect anymore. She had the traffic cam footage. She had the GPS data. She had the admission timestamps. She had the toxicology report proving Taryn was sober. And she had the audio recording of Cross ordering the cover-up in the break room. But releasing it now would be messy. They would spin it. They would say the footage was inconclusive. They would say Cross made a judgment call. They would destroy her character before the file even hit the news cycle. She needed to force them to destroy themselves. She looked at the command she had queued up earlier. The fire alarm override is greater than override. Fire alarm system. Zone 4 administration is greater than trigger. False positive is greater than status. Armed. She modified the code. She didn't want a false positive anymore. A false positive was an annoyance. She typed a new line. Is greater than link. Fire suppression system. Zone 4. Is greater than command. Halon discharge disabled. Is greater than link. Magnetic door locks. VIP wing. Is greater than command. Fail secure lock on alarm. She wasn't going to start a fire. She was going to create a cage. When the senator arrived, when the cameras were live, when the perfect family image was being broadcast to the morning news, she was going to lock the doors. And then, she was going to put the truth on the screens that were meant to display the senator's campaign slogans. She plugged a flash drive into the terminal. She began the upload of the traffic footage to the hospital's internal broadcast network. The hidden past wasn't just a backstory. It was a weapon, and she just took the safety off. "Dr. Cross," Zola whispered to the empty air. "You wanted context? I'm about to give you all the context you can handle." Senator Vane arrived not with a siren, but with a silence that swallowed the room. He walked through the sliding doors at 5:15 a.m., flanked by a phalanx of aides and a videographer who moved like a crab, scuttling low to get the angles that made the senator look tall, paternal, and burdened by the weight of public service. Vane was a man of manufactured edges, silver hair perfectly coiffed, a suit that absorbed the harsh hospital lighting rather than reflecting it. He didn't look like a man whose son had just committed vehicular manslaughter. He looked like a man arriving to bless a fleet of fishing boats. Zola watched from the station. Her finger hovered over the enter key. The command to lock the doors and hijack the screens was typed, parsed, and ready. She watched Cross greet the senator. It was a masterclass in nonverbal submission. Cross, usually the alpha of the floor, shrank by 2 inches. He clasped the senator's hand with both of his, bowing his head slightly. "He's resting comfortably, Senator," Cross said, his voice pitched perfectly for the boom mic hovering overhead. "We've taken every precaution." "Thank you, Balian," Vane said. His voice was warm, like sand. "I know how strained your resources are. I appreciate you making the space." "We always make space for family," Cross replied. Zola's stomach twisted. She prepared to press the key. She prepared to turn the monitors behind them into a looping broadcast of the hit and run. She prepared to watch the color drain from Vane's face as the doors magnetically sealed, trapping him in the room with his own crime. But then, Vane turned. He didn't turn to the elevators. He turned to the waiting room. The purge hadn't been fully successful. A few patients remained the stubborn, the immobile, the desperate. An elderly woman in a wheelchair with oxygen tubing, a young mother rocking a baby who hadn't stopped crying for 3 hours. Vane walked over to them. The cameras followed. "Is the press set up ready?" the chief of staff whispered to Cross, loud enough for Zola to hear. "Yes," Cross murmured back. "But why here? Why not the conference room?" "The optics," the woman replied, her eyes fixed on the senator. "He's not just here for chase. He's announcing the Insolvency Relief Act at 6 a.m. If he doesn't sign the pledge on camera today, the state pulls the subsidy for this place." Zola froze. Her finger stopped millimeters from the key. The Insolvency Relief Act. She knew what that was. Everyone in the medical field knew. It was the only thing keeping the hospital's inner-city branch open. It funded the dialysis center. It paid for the insulin bank. It covered the salaries of the 3 pediatric nurses who worked the weekend shifts. Without that signature, the hospital wasn't just broke, it was dead. The doors wouldn't just lock for an hour, they would board up forever. The senator knelt beside the elderly woman. He took her hand. He looked into her eyes with a compassion that looked terrifyingly genuine. "We're going to get you taken care of," Vane said to her. "That's why I'm here, to make sure places like this can always help you." The camera shutter clicked. The narrative was being cemented in real time. The senator was the savior. The hospital was the sanctuary. And Chase Vane was just a footnote. The trap snapped shut around Zola's throat. If she executed the command, she would expose the truth. She would destroy Vane. She would destroy Cross. Justice for Taryn Kadir would be swift, violent, and absolute. But the scandal would detonate the relief bill. The senator would be indicted. The funding would evaporate. The hospital would collapse under the weight of the investigation and the loss of state support. The dialysis center would close. The 32 patients who came in every week for life-saving filtration would have nowhere to go. They would die, slowly, of uremic poisoning. The insulin bank would shutter. The diabetics in the neighborhood, who relied on the subsidized vials, would ration their doses until they went into ketoacidosis. Zola looked at the data on her screen. Taryn Kadir. 1 life. The community, thousands. The system wasn't just protecting itself with walls and lies. It was protecting itself with hostages. It had tied the survival of the innocent to the prosperity of the guilty. To cut the throat of the monster, she would have to slash through the bodies of the people she had sworn to protect. Nurse Quintrell. Cross was standing at the desk. He had pulled away from the photo op. His face was flushed, his eyes bright with the manic energy of a man walking a tightrope. "The senator wants to thank the staff," Cross said. "I need you to come over, shake his hand, smile." He paused, leaning in closer. The smell of his expensive cologne was suffocating. And Zola, regarding the hallway patient. "Mr. Kadir." Zola didn't look up. "Yes? He's being transferred to long-term care at County," Cross said. "I signed the order. Since he's unresponsive, we need the neurobed for the cameras." He wasn't just moving Taryn, he was discarding the evidence. County General was a warehouse for the indigent. Taryn would be a number there. He would develop pneumonia within a week. He would die quietly, miles away from the crime scene, and his death certificate would list natural causes. "He won't survive the transport," Zola said. "He won't survive anyway," Cross whispered. "Let's be real, Zola. The brain damage is profound, but this hospital has to survive. Look at that old woman over there. Look at that baby. If Vane walks out of here unhappy, they lose everything. Do you understand the math?" The math. It was the same cold calculus she had used in the field, sacrificing a squad to save a battalion, burning a safe house to protect a network. Cross was offering her a complicity pact. "Help me bury this boy, and we save the village." Zola looked at the enter key. It was a small, gray square of plastic. It was the trigger for a moral nuclear bomb. She looked at Taryn's empty spot in the hallway. She looked at the mother rocking the crying baby. The mother caught Zola's eye. She looked exhausted, terrified, and hopeful. She was looking at the senator like he was a god who had come to answer her prayers. If Zola destroyed Vane now, she destroyed that mother's hope. Zola's hand trembled. For the first time in 20 years, the obsidian cracked. She felt a tear, hot and humiliating, prick the corner of her eye. She couldn't do it. She couldn't kill the dialysis patients to save Taryn's memory. The utilitarian weight was too heavy. The system had checkmated her by making itself essential to the survival of the poor. Slowly, painfully, Zola moved her hand away from the keyboard. She reached for the mouse. She moved the cursor to the top right corner of the terminal window. "Is greater than command canceled." She closed the back door. She closed the camera feed. She closed the file. The digital evidence vanished from the screen, retreating back into the encrypted dark of her phone. "Good girl," Cross said. He didn't know how close he had come to annihilation. He just saw a nurse falling back in line. "Now come on. The senator is waiting." Zola stood up. Her legs felt like lead. She walked around the desk. She walked into the bright lights of the cameras. She stood next to Dr. Cross. She stood next to Senator Vane. "This is Zola," Cross said, beaming. "Our head night nurse. She runs a tight ship." "A pleasure, Zola," Vane said, extending his manicured hand. "Thank you for taking such good care of my boy." Zola took his hand. It was warm, dry, the hand of a man who had never touched the blood he spilled. "It's my job," Zola said. The camera flashed. The image was captured forever. Zola Quintrell, the black nurse with the stoic face, shaking hands with the man who had killed her patient, smiling faintly for the sake of the hospital's funding. She had saved the many, but as the flash blinded her, she felt something vital inside her chest, something she had protected through wars, through loss, through years of silence, finally and quietly die. She had become part of the pattern. 3 months later, the ribbon-cutting ceremony for the Vane Community Cardiac Center was held in the lobby. The air smelled of fresh lilies and industrial floor wax. There was champagne in plastic flutes, and the local news station had sent their B-team anchor to cover the event. Senator Vane was there, of course. He looked tan, rested, and victorious. His polling numbers had stabilized, bolstered by his image as a champion of urban healthcare. Chase Vane was there too, standing in the back, his arm out of the sling, typing on a new phone with both thumbs. He looked bored. He looked untouched. Dr. Balian Cross stood at the podium. He had been named the director of the new wing. His lab coat was starch white, embroidered with his new title. He spoke about commitment, integrity, and the sacred trust between a doctor and his community. Zola Quintrell watched from the triage desk. The emergency department didn't stop for the ceremony. The doors still hissed open. The stretchers still rolled in. A diabetic man with a necrotic toe was arguing with a billing clerk. A teenager with a broken nose was dripping blood onto a piece of gauze. The machine churned on, indifferent to the speeches happening 50 feet away. Zola looked different. Not on the outside, her uniform was the same, her posture just as rigid, her silver pen still clipped to her pocket. But the ink stain on her thumb was gone. She had scrubbed it clean. She didn't look at the senator, she looked at the monitor. Taram Kadir was dead. He had died 3 days after the transfer to County General. The official cause was complications from cerebral edema. There was no autopsy. There was no investigation. His family, overwhelmed by grief and lacking the funds for a lawyer, had accepted the hospital's condolences and the small, quiet settlement offered by an anonymous donor for funeral expenses. He was gone, erased. The applause in the lobby swelled. Cross was shaking hands, soaking in the adulation. He looked over the crowd and caught Zola's eye. He smiled. It was a benevolent smile now. He felt generous. He felt safe. He believed that Zola had been tamed, that she had accepted the hierarchy, that she was just another cog that had been greased into silence. He walked over to the desk as the crowd began to disperse. "Beautiful ceremony, wasn't it?" Cross said, leaning his hip against the counter. "We secured funding for 5 years. 5 years, Zola. Do you know how many lives that saves?" "I know the math, doctor," Zola said. Her voice was a flat line. "I knew you would," Cross nodded. "You're pragmatic. That's why I like you. In fact, I was thinking, with my new administrative duties, I need a floor manager I can trust. Someone who understands nuance. The pay bump is significant." He was buying her again, not with fear this time, but with inclusion. He was inviting her into the inner circle. Zola finished typing her note. She hit save. She turned her chair slowly to face him. "I don't want the promotion," she said. Cross frowned, his smile faltering slightly. "Zola, don't be difficult. It's a reward. We won." "You didn't win, Balian," she said. It was the first time she had ever used his first name. It stripped the title from him instantly. The air between them cooled. "Excuse me?" Cross whispered, his eyes darting to the nearby nurses. Zola reached into her pocket. She didn't pull out a gun. She didn't pull out a phone. She pulled out a single, folded piece of paper. It was a printout of a QR code. She slid it across the desk. "That," Zola said softly, "is a link to a dead man's switch." Cross stared at the paper. "What is this?" "It's a cloud server," Zola explained, her voice sounding like she was giving discharge instructions. "It contains the traffic cam footage of Chase Vane's car. It contains the GPS data of the hit and run. It contains the toxicology report you ignored. And it contains the audio recording of you ordering me to purge the waiting room to hide the victims." Cross's face went pale. The tan seemed to drain away, leaving his skin the color of wet dough. He reached for the paper. Zola put her hand over it. Her grip was iron. "The server is automated," she continued. "It pings my phone every 12 hours. If I don't enter a biometric key, it emails the entire file to the State Attorney General, the FBI, and 3 major news outlets. If I die, it sends. If I get fired, it sends. If I disappear, it sends." Cross looked at her. The arrogance was gone. The confidence was gone. He looked at the senator laughing in the lobby, then back at the black nurse sitting calmly behind the desk. You can't," Cross stammered. "The funding, if you release that, the hospital closes. You said you understood the math." "I do," Zola said. "That's why I'm not releasing it." She leaned forward. Her glasses caught the reflection of the fluorescent lights, hiding her eyes. "I'm not going to destroy the hospital, doctor, and I'm not going to put you in prison. That would be too easy. You'd get a lawyer. You'd get a plea deal. You'd be out in 2 years writing a memoir. Then what do you want?" Cross hissed. "I want the floor," Zola said. "You have the floor. You're the charge nurse." "No," Zola corrected. I want the standard. From this moment on, you don't make a single decision based on insurance or donor status or race. You don't divert ambulances. You don't downgrade triages. If a homeless addict comes in with chest pain, he gets the same cardiac workup as the senator. If a roofer comes in with a headache, he gets the scan. Zola, we have budgets. I don't care, she cut him off. You will find the money, you will cut your salary, you will squeeze the senator, you will defraud the insurance companies if you have to, but every single person who walks through those doors gets treated like a human being. If you slip up, if I see one patient neglected because you're playing politics, I stop entering the code. Cross stared at her. He realized with a dawning horror what had happened. He hadn't hired a servant. He had hired a warden. The racism of the system, the assumption that she was powerless, that she was just a body to be used and discarded, had blinded him to the threat. He had let a predator into his house because he thought she was furniture. You're blackmailing me, Cross whispered. I'm managing you, Zola said. She picked up her silver pen. Now, bed 6 needs a central line. Go do it yourself. And wash your hands first. Cross looked at the QR code. He looked at Zola. He looked at the exit. There was no exit. He swallowed hard. He nodded. Yes, Nurse Quintrell, he said. He turned and walked toward bed 6. He didn't strut. He didn't bark. He walked with the heavy, measured step of a man carrying a load he could never set down. Zola watched him go. She didn't smile. There was no victory in this. Taryn was still dead. The senator was still rich. The system was still a monster, grinding bones to make bread. But she had her hand on the leash now. She looked down at her watch. 6 a.m. Shift change. The sun was coming up over the city, casting long, bruised shadows across the waiting room. The new day was starting. The sick were coming. Zola opened the next chart. Name, she said to the empty air, practicing for the next soul she would have to save. She tapped her wrist. The pulse of the hospital continued, but the rhythm had changed. It was beating to her time now. She wasn't just the nurse anymore. She was the ghost in the machine, and she would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Zola Quintrell capped her pen. The sound was small, sharp, and final. The silence that followed was hers. Sometimes the only way to fix a broken world is to hold the pieces together with your own 2 hands, even if the glass cuts you every single day.